Resa Mai has graciously agreed to be our third storyteller tonight. And this slot is always the most challenging because it is the only thing between you and the refreshment table. So we really appreciate everyone who goes in this slot, especially Resa tonight. Resa is a reader, writer, student, and library director at the Morris Area Public Library. She has a PhD in philosophy, and she travels as a professional development speaker to libraries across the country. You can see her cooking videos, nothing to do with libraries apparently, at morrislibrary.com, where each month she shares her love of food and entertainment. She's the mom of 3 Grand Mai. Did you get that? Resa Mai, Grand Mai, of 3. And she enjoys every minute she spends with her family. Often accused of overindulging, not overindulging, she will be sharing a story of love and learning on the brink of disaster. Let's welcome Resa.
Is this the right height? It'll work. It'll work. I told my daughter I was coming, and she said, "You got to start with a joke." And I said, "You know what? I'm not telling a funny story." She said, "Mom, you're always funny. You got to start with a joke." And I said, "It's not really appropriate for what we're talking about." And she said, "Well, just tell them something that happened with your life." So I thought, okay. So as we were getting ready to come here today, I do work up in Morris. And as I was trying to leave, there were a lot of people in the library that wanted help. And so they were lined up. And I got in line to say goodbye to people, and we waited and walked through and got through the line. And as I was leaving, I thought, I'm driving all the way down to Normal. I need to get some gas. There's no place to get gas except for the place that's least expensive, where there was a huge line. So I thought, fine, we've got some time. We were going to be here by 7. We weren't, because we had to wait in line to get gas. So we waited to get gas, and of course I didn't have my credit card, so I had to go in and pay. And people were getting sodas, and they were getting Slurpees, and they were getting munchies. So I had to wait in another line, and we were probably 15 minutes late getting here, because I swear every place we went, we had to wait in line. And we got here, and I wasn't getting Slurpees. I didn't get anything to drink. So I'm looking, and I thought, well, I'm going to get some punch. What? No punch line. Okay. So we're going to start with that, but it's also a little bit of insight on me, because I really do love to be happy and to be funny and to enjoy everything. But sometimes life doesn't work out that way. And I'm going to talk a little bit about a time a few years ago where I made mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. Sometimes I make mistakes that are so huge, so cataclysmic, that in hindsight they could be comic, but when you're living them, they're not. And I was at a point in my life where nothing was going right. My job was not where I wanted to be. My career was not where I envisioned myself. My kids were in those awkwards. Everything I do was wrong, even though it's their fault. Everything was just really, really hard, and I was getting really down and really frustrated and didn't know where to turn. I found that my depression and my frustration, I was talking really slow. I was moving really slow, and I saw myself in the shadow, and I was that slump of, you know, that person's either a victim or feels like a victim, because everything about me was melting into the despair that I felt inside, and I didn't know what to do. So I did what every self-sabotaging person does. I gathered my pain together. Everything I did wrong, everything the world had done wrong, I gathered it to me. I formed it into almost a palpable ball and tossed it from hand to hand. And with the precision of the lucky, or maybe the unlucky, I lobbed it at the one person who was still standing next to me, my first husband. And in that moment, I thought maybe I was going to have to break in a second husband because I didn't do it nicely. I let all of the pain and anguish that I had been feeling bombard him. And I said, I'm done. I don't like this anymore. I don't like me anymore. There's nothing here. I'm miserable. And in my infinite wisdom, I said, and I know you're miserable too. There's nothing between us. We need to just admit it, own it, see it. And if I had been looking, I would have seen his eyes were shocked, were hurt, and were surprised. And I would have known in that moment that he was not going to go quickly or quietly or easily, but I wasn't looking in his eyes. And I wasn't hearing anything he was saying. I was simply emoting because I was hurting. And I laid it out to him that everything was useless, everything was gone, there was nothing left. And I felt that way. And I made sure that as isolated as I felt, I made sure that I was becoming to live that isolated. When I would go to bed at night, I would lay on the inch or two of the outside of the king-size bed. My arm would hang off, my leg would hang off, sometimes my head would be hanging off, and I would try to sleep as silently and as immobile as possible because I didn't want to make a ripple in our lives. I just wanted to stop. And I knew, of course, it was because there was nothing there that was worth saving or even worth acknowledging. And then, as we talked about tonight, one night it happened. He changed everything. I was getting ready to go to bed. It was dark. The kids were in bed, asleep. Dinner was done. Dishes were done. The cats were petted. The cats were fed. The cats were watered. The lights were off. And as you can tell, at this point in my life, I was procrastinating about everything I was doing. So I was, again, not trying to move in my life. I was treading water as opposed to swimming towards shore. But I knew everyone in town was asleep. It was the middle of the night. I should go to bed. So I trudged upstairs quietly and went in the bathroom and took a deep breath. And like I was doing, procrastinated. So I brushed and I flossed, I washed and I brushed, I peed and I wiped, I changed into my pajamas, I looked around, I might have, rearranged the medicine cabinet, hung up the towel for the 10th time and thought, he's got to be asleep, right? I don't want to pursue this. So I looked around some more and I put on my moisturizer and I washed my jewelry and I moisturized my hands and checked the clock and I said, okay, this is good. He's got to be asleep. So let my eyes adjust, walked into the bedroom, tried to get my minuscule measure of mattress, laid down very carefully, and there was a crinkle and a rustle, and there was something in the bed, and it was dark, so I couldn't see what it was, but I could tell that it was something clunky and junky, and it hadn't been there earlier, but it was rustling, and I reached up, and I snatched my hand back, because, heaven forbid, I didn't want to grab a handful of husband. Well, turns out what I was grabbing wasn't alive, husband or not. It was stuff, and it was loud, and it was under the blankets, and it was in the middle of my room, and it didn't make any sense. And as I sat there, half on the bed and half off the bed, trying to peer in the dark and figure out what in the world could have gotten there while I was at work that day, lights came on. My husband wasn't asleep, so all that bathroom procrastination was lost. And he looked at me, and he looked, and he motioned for me to pull back the blanket, and I pulled back the blanket, and there, in the bed, were birth certificates and baby teeth. There were report cards and preschool ornaments and Christmas cards. There were things that we had planned, our Christmas cards we sent out, party invitations. There were corks, wine corks with dates written on them. Our first, little side note, our first date we went on, we went to a Chinese restaurant, and after dinner we got our fortune cookies and we opened them, and he looked at his and said, "Wow, my fortune is exactly right on." I said, "Oh, mine's kind of a dud. This is a really bad fortune. It has nothing to do with me." And we swapped, and I read his fortune, and it said, "You are analytical and cautious by nature." And he read my fortune that said the exact same thing. It bode well, because it had been years and decades, but there in the bed between us were these fortunes and cards and letters we had written each other and concert tickets and menus and trips we had planned, and it was a huge pile. He must have gone through every drawer in our house, every cabinet, every cupboard. He went through the safe. He went through the corners of the attic and the basement that we hadn't been to in years, and it was piled in a huge plaster of Paris hands and old shoes and t-shirts from fundraisers, and I looked at it and I said, "It's a mess." And he said, "Yeah, it is, but it's our mess, and don't ever say this mess is nothing." Thank you.